Dude, cover your mouth. Welcome to Flynndogg Woodwork. So today I didn't Google deep, but I YouTube deep. I found 13 hacks that I thought were pretty interesting. Let's take a look at these 13 hacks and see if any of them interest you. So over the last week, I've scoured YouTube trying to find some unique hacks that I hadn't seen before. And we all know there's a ton of videos out there showing you some unique woodworking hacks and tips. So what I wanted to do with this video was to present 13 interesting hacks that I found on YouTube that hopefully you find interesting as well. And because of this, none of these hacks were invented by me. They were just presented on other YouTube channels, which I found quite interesting. One resource that I really found valuable was Colin Connect's channel, Woodwork Web. If you haven't checked out this channel, go check it out, as it really is a valuable wealth of information. And that's where our first hack is coming from. Let's get into it and I'll show you this hack. So somewhere in your shop, you probably have some brass setup blocks. And if you're anything like me, you probably have one or two missing. And that's what this first hack is all about, creating a storage solution for these setup blocks. So the material for this first hack really couldn't be easier. All you need is a little piece of scrap 2x4. So let's go over to the table saw and I'll show you how to get started. So the first thing that we're going to do with this 2x4 is to scribe a line right about at the center of the 2x4. Once we have that line scribed, we're now going to create hash marks evenly across the board. And the number of hash marks will equal the number of setup blocks you have. Now I have a 5-piece setup block set, but I only have 4 right now. But I'm going to go ahead and put 5 hash marks in case I find that setup block. So now it's just a matter of scribing out those hash marks. So now that I have those hash marks lined out, I now want to take a drill with a Forstner bit that's just a little bit larger than your largest setup block. So in my case, I have a 1/2 inch setup block and I have a 3/4 inch Forstner bit. And now it's just a matter of boring out those holes at each one of those hash marks. And this doesn't have to be perfect by any means. So now we have our block with the 5 holes, and you will notice that I switched over to a smaller Forstner bit just to fit some of those smaller setup blocks. And here it is with all the setup blocks lined up and in place. However, this isn't what caught my eye about this little hack. There's one more thing we have to do to this block. Let's go over to the drill press and I'll show you. So over here at the drill press, I've grabbed a small rare earth magnet, and I've placed a Forstner bit that's approximately the same diameter as this magnet. I'm going to drill a small hole in the back of our setup block jig so that we can place this magnet right in the back. So let's do that next. Lastly, I'm going to add a little bit of CA glue to the back of this setup block holder, and then I'll apply some accelerator to the back of the magnet. So now with the magnet installed and the setup blocks in place, I've placed some labels, and now we can place this anywhere there's a metal surface. And this makes it great to have your setup blocks exactly where you need them when you need them. And guess what? I found that last setup block, so now I have my full set. So big shout out to Colin Connect at Woodwork Web for sharing that first little hack. Now let's move on to our second little hack. So we all know you can never have enough clamps, and clamps can be quite expensive. But did you know that there's a way to glue up small boxes without using a single clamp? So this is a classic way to glue up things without using clamps. And I was recently reminded about this technique when watching David over at Make Something. So for this technique, all you really need is a flat surface and a couple of 2x4s. Now for this right here, I've taken an old piece of walnut and screwed in a couple of 2x4s. So let's go take this over to the assembly table and I'll show you how this works. So once you have the structure of this jig set up, all you're going to need is a couple of shims. And these are shims that I just got at Home Depot. You can make these on your own at the bandsaw, or you can just purchase these at a big box store. Now the key for this is to have both of your 2x4s approximately the width of what you want to clamp up. Once you have that done, you can grab your shims and put them into place. Once you have your box in place, you can place those shims on the other side of the box and tighten it down by just tapping it with a hammer. And this can be done on each side of the box. And by adding those wedges to both sides of the box, it provides a really secure clamping surface that you can even lift this entire jig by the box itself. And this can be a very useful method if you're batching out a bunch of boxes that are all the same size, or if you just make a lot of small boxes in general. Well, that's 2 quick tips for you. Now let's move on to our third tip, which has everything to do with sanding. So this next tip is one that I saw on one of the foreign channels that doesn't speak any English, that just show how to make it. And all you need for this is a little piece of 2x4, a couple of binder clips, and a couple of screws. Let's go take a look. So for this hack, all we're going to do is attach 2 binder clips to either side of this 2x4. We're also going to be using a washer to give the head of the screw a little bit to hold on to. So now you can see we have both binder clips attached to either side of that 2x4, and it's these binder clips that we're going to place our sandpaper into. So by placing our block in the center of our sandpaper, we can wrap around the sandpaper and attach it with the binder clips. And just like that, you have an automatic sanding block. Well, that covers 3 items so far. Now let's move on to our next one, which I also found on one of those foreign channels. So maybe you don't have a marking gauge, or you have a mark that you need to create that your marking gauge can't handle. That's where this next tip comes in handy. And all we're going to need for this one is a flat piece of 2x4 and a wood screw. So let's get started. So this one literally couldn't be easier. And we're done. But let me show you a little bit more in depth on how we're going to use this jig. Let's go back to the assembly table. So once we have that screw started, we then can take a hand screwdriver and lower it until it's at 3/4 of an inch. Once we feel comfortable with our measurement, we then can move it on to using it as a marking gauge. By resting the base of our marking gauge up against that wood, we then can move it back and forth to strike our line. And you can see there, that should be exactly 3/4 of an inch. And it is exactly. And by taking your handheld screwdriver, there really are no limits with this marking gauge. You're just limited by the thickness of the wood and the length of your screw. Alright, so those have been some pretty easy hacks so far. This next hack has everything to do with fixing those cracks in your lumber. Let's see how we can fix this board. So in this example, I'm using some pallet wood, but this trick works with any type of wood. Let's say this was walnut and we had a crack right down the center of it. And this really sucks. The problem with this is when you try to apply some wood glue to the top of it, all that wood glue stays on the top of the surface and doesn't get sucked into that crack. And yes, I said this sucks. The good news is I've got 2 suckers right here that I can apply to that wood glue and get that glue sucked into the seam. So now with some wood glue applied liberally to that crack, I then can take my vacuum and suck that glue into the seam. Now with the glue in the seam, I then can apply my clamp. And you can see from this angle here how that glue has reached all the way through that crack. Well, that wood glue hack was one that I learned from Bourbon Moth a couple of years ago. And this is the first time that I've actually tried it, and I'm quite pleased with the results. So now that we're talking about glue, let's move on to another glue hack that I use all the time. If you don't know about this one, you need to, because it is super helpful. So this next hack is a little bit of a clamping hack. However, it doesn't involve any clamps whatsoever. This little tip is very useful if you're trying to get a project done and you don't have the time to let glue set up overnight. It's also very helpful if you have an angle you're trying to glue together where your clamps might not easily attach. So for this example, we're going to use this on a simple miter. Let's go over to the assembly table and I'll show you how to do this. So for this hack, all we need is some wood glue, some CA glue, and some accelerator. What we're going to do is we're going to apply the wood glue in little dabs across this mitered joint. Once we have that wood glue in little dots across the mitered joint, we're now going to apply some CA glue. In the same fashion, I'll apply some little dabs of CA glue where I didn't place the wood glue. And you can see from this here, there's wood glue, CA glue, wood glue, CA glue. Next, on the opposite side of the miter joint, I'm just going to apply some accelerant. Then we can attach the 2 pieces together and it should create a bond immediately. And in less than a minute, that CA glue acts as a clamp as that wood glue is allowed to cure. And this is perfect when you need to do a quick glue up and you need to move on to the next step. So we're about halfway through our 13 hacks. That was hack number 6. Before we move on to our 7th hack, I ask you to do me a huge favor, hit that subscribe button, leave a like and leave a comment, as it truly does help out this small woodworking channel. Now let's move on to our 7th hack. So this next tip comes from 731 Woodworks, and I want to give a quick shout out to Matt Outlaw, as he was actually the 13th subscriber to this channel. So thanks, Matt. And this next hack has everything to do with straightening out longer boards that you may have a problem getting through your table saw. let me show you how you can extend your fence. So for this tip, you want to grab a 2x4 and look down both ends of the 2x4. You want to make sure that this 2x4 is completely straight and flat. Once we've confirmed that this board is completely straight and flat, I'm then going to take a couple of clamps and attach it to my fence. Another helpful thing to have as you're trying to straighten out longer boards is to have an outfeed roller at the front of your table saw. This will give you support as you're trying to straighten out those longer boards. With the table saw fence extended, this will give us the support we need to straighten out one edge of that long board. So let's do that now. Now that you have one side flattened out, you then can remove the fence and straighten out the other side. And with one side ripped and straightened, we then can straighten up the other side. And just like that, we essentially have a board that's jointed on both sides without having a jointer. And this is why, if you're saving up for either a planer or a jointer, I would recommend getting a planer first, as you can do a lot of the features a planer can over at the table saw. Since we're talking about straightening out wood at the table saw, let me show you one other way that you can joint smaller pieces of wood just using a piece of plywood. So for this example, I'm going to use this very strangely shaped piece of wood. You can see there's curves on one side and there's some bark inclusion on the other. Now, since this is such an oddly shaped piece of wood, we're not going to get a whole lot of wood out of this material. However, we will be able to straighten it out. So let's go grab our plywood and get started. So for this example, I'm simply going to take some double-sided tape and attach it to the edge of the plywood. Once I have that double-sided tape in line, I'll then take my piece of wood that I want to joint and I'll line up the edges that I need to get straight. So in this case, it's at the very bottom right here and at the very top right here. So if we look a little bit closer, you can see that I have the edge of the bark inclusion at the very top lined up with the edge of the plywood and the very bottom lined up as well. Next, I'll raise the blade so that it's sure to cut through the entire piece of wood. Once we have the blade raised, I'll then pinch the plywood so that the plywood is touching both the blade and the fence, and then I'll lock the fence down. Now it's just a matter of making our first cut. Now with one side flattened out, we then can remove our piece of wood from that jig and then flatten out the other side, having the flat side resting right against the table saw fence. With my flat side resting against my fence, I'll adjust my table saw fence so that we can remove all those curves. And then I can make the cut. Well, it's a little bit pathetic, but after straightening out both sides of that piece of wood, we were able to get a perfectly straight piece of wood that could be used in a project. And you can see by adding the pieces of cutoffs, you can see how we were able to get that perfectly straight piece of wood out of this crazy shaped piece. So we're moving right along here. Now let's move on to our 8th tip, which is another one from Colin Kinnett at Woodwork Web. So this is a simple one, and I'm not quite sure I didn't think of this myself. It involves a sponge and a little bit of water. So for this one, all we need is that little sponge, and you can cut these sponges into little pieces depending on how big you want them. The other thing that you want to have is a piece of Tupperware with some water in it, and you can seal this water up when you're done using it. And these two little items are going to help us out on cleaning up a lot of that glue squeeze out. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So let's go back to that piece of wood that had the crack that we fixed earlier. The first thing that we want to do is to take an old rag and wipe off all the excess glue. Now, one problem with this is there'll still be some glue residue on that wood, so if you apply some stain later, that wood glue will show up. And that's where this sponge comes into play. You simply take that sponge, get it a little damp, and wipe off all that excess glue. And it's as simple as that. Who would have thought having a little bit of damp sponge in an old Tupperware could save you a lot of trouble and heartache when you go to stain your wood? And not only that, but if you dump your water out and rinse out your sponge, you can use this little hack as many times as you want. So our next hack is not so much a hack, but it's something that I recommend that you have in your shop. And that's Starbond's medium thick black CA glue. Let me show you how you use this. So knots in wood are something that you're going to run into on a regular basis if you do any amount of woodworking. These knots can be unstable and they can also create divots in your workpiece. But by using this next tip, you can not only remove those knots and stabilize them, but you can also make sure your surface is completely flat. So here you see a small knot in this butcher block. Now if this were a countertop, this knot would collect all sorts of residue and this knot could potentially fall out. But if you add a little bit of this black Star-Bond super glue, you can simply fill that knot up with the black glue, and then you can apply some accelerant. Now if you're not in a hurry, you could let this dry overnight and then simply sand it down. For me, I'm just going to add a little bit of an accelerant. Once you've let that CA glue cure up, you simply take your sander and sand it down. And just like that, you have a stabilized knot that's ready to be finished. So if you don't have any Star-Bond medium thick black CA glue, I highly recommend it, as this will stabilize almost any knot in any species of wood. So if you've been watching this channel for any period of time, you know that I have a little bit of a weird fascination on how we can create circles on wood. This next hack has everything to do with that. Let's grab a tape measure and a nail and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. So I found this next tip on one of those foreign channels where they don't speak at all, and when I saw it, I knew I had to try it. Let's grab some plywood and see if it works. So for this tip, I want to take my nail and place it where the center of my circle is. And for this example, I want to create a 10-inch circle. So I've extended my measuring tape to 5 inches, which is the radius of that circle. Next up, I want to take my tape measure and hook it on the edge of that nail and place my marker right on the tip of the tape measure. Then I'm going to take my tape measure and rotate it around that nail. And just like that, we have a perfect 10-inch circle. So this was a pretty easy way to make a circle. Now I'm not going to lie and say that this is exactly 10 inches diameter, but it is pretty close. So if you need to make a circle and you're not too particular about how wide your diameter needs to be, this is an easy way to do it. Well, we're getting down to it. Only 2 tips left to go. Let's take a look at this next tip, as I'm sure it's going to help you find those missing items that you put around the shop. So if you're like me, you probably have a million things like tape measures laying around your shop. And this is because I simply misplace them. I'll be working on something, I'll set it down, and then I'll forget where I placed it. And then I was thinking, what can I do to make this thing stand out? And that's when I watched Colin Kinnett once again, who had a great idea for making this thing stand out. Now I chose red because it's what I have laying around the shop, but really you could choose any color you want. A fluorescent color would be a great idea for this hack. So this idea has everything to do with helping a blind person find something. And I thought, what better way to do it than to put a big red X on it. Now time will tell with this little tip, but I think it's a good idea. By placing some red tape or some fluorescent tape on those items that you lose regularly, maybe you'll find those items just a little bit easier. Maybe you want to put it on a pencil or a pen, or a key for your drill press, which is something I'm definitely doing. Or maybe things have gotten so bad you need to put this stuff on something like a hammer. Either way, I'm going to give this a try and see if it helps me find those misplaced items. So we're down to our last tip, and this is one that I also got from Colin Kinnett, and I think it's a really good idea. So you've all heard me gripe about my drill press a number of times. This next tip has to do with removing a couple of pieces from that drill press to make it a little bit easier to use. So almost every drill press has these 3 little knobs that allow you to move your drill bit up and down on your drill press. However, a lot of times these knobs can get in the way, but you can actually remove these knobs. And this is kind of a game changer for me. By removing the 2 knobs, you still have 1 knob where you can move the drill press up and down and not have the other 2 knobs get in the way. So I'm not quite sure why I didn't think of this before, but by removing 1 or 2 of those knobs, you can free up a lot of space to give you the extra capacity that you need at your drill press. Well, that's 13 quick and dirty tips that I learned by YouTubing just a little too deep. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment. Until next time, take care as always.